This video is explaining super stories and how to set them up. It's intended for wire editors on the news desk, generally those working in shifts on the Nation World Business Desk or the sports desk. And a super story is a special class of text in CCI that contains within it both a long form version of the story and a brief version. And why it's nice is our papers have a variety of different space configurations, and so we prepared the story without regard for how much space a given paper will have. And as a designer goes to put that paper together, if they have a large news hole, they can choose to run the story as a standalone story with a fair amount of depth, or if they've got a tight news hole, they can run the same story as a brief. And because it has been set up in this way, the pre-edited text will work in either of those configurations. So I'm about to show you an example of that, which should make it a little bit clearer. So I'm going to go to look at the wire story folders that have been put together for today. Let's look at this school shooting one. I'm going to go to the story folder. So this is an actual one from production. So if we were to look and see how this story ran in Sacramento, for instance, I'm going to open the page so we can take a look. And you'll see that it ran as a standalone story, and it ran with a photo. So this looks like a pretty normal story. So I'm going to close this and see how the same story ran in Tri-Cities, for instance. Tri-Cities had a smaller news hole on this particular day. So I'm going to open it up in Layout Champ. And in Tri-Cities, that same text ran as a brief without a photo. So here we see 12 killed, 12 more hit in Kentucky school shooting. It's a brief. So let's see how this looked in News Director. When I open up the story, you'll see that everything's in the body. At the top, we have a summary of the story that becomes the brief, and then underneath, the full version of the story. The brief, which is enclosed in this blue box, is going to be the only thing that's displayed in those papers that run it as a brief. The story itself will be suppressed, and vice versa. In papers that choose to run it as a standalone story, the brief will be suppressed and the rest of the story will show up. And so as a wire editor, we provide both formats, and then depending on which shape a designer puts on the page, one or the other shows up. So here we go. Let's talk about how to make this happen. Oh, before I do, one key point to mention is we always trim the brief piece down to a consistent length. And that is so we're not having to trim the brief for every single usage of it. You can see in this particular instance, there are easily 30 different packages here. We wouldn't want to have to trim a brief 30 or 20 or 10 different times. So when it's set up initially, we trim it to a set length, and then all of the brief shapes that are configured to work with this superstory workflow are all set to the same length, so that text will work automatically. So having said that, let's go set one up. So as with other stories, we'll start by going to the wire workspace. So here I am. I can use one of my existing shortcuts to find a good story to choose. So let's look at our national wire for this. Go find something. Here's a gun show. Gathers just a few miles from mass shooting. Having decided this is going to be a good option, I'm going to right click and save it just like I would any other wire story. I am going to save it into one of our existing desks. I go to all desk. This is a national international story, so I go to national international and I choose among the subdesks here by double clicking on one of them. So if I knew this was only going to be needed for early papers, I might choose deadline 1 early. Or for instance, if I knew it was only going to be of interest to papers in the West, I might choose News Desk West. In this particular case, I'm going to choose Common because I know that will, when I go to create packages, I will have every single product listed as an option, as a checkbox for me. So I'll come down here to the name and I'll use our existing naming convention. This is going to be a little bit of a bastardization because I don't want to get it mixed up with the live stories. So bear with me. So I do that. It has created a story folder. You'll see it listed in my recent story folders. Still leaves me here in the Wire workspace so that if I wanted, for instance, add a photo, because some papers may want to run this as a standalone story and therefore would need a photo, I can find an appropriate photo from the wires and can drag it directly here. So that story folder now has a photo associated with it. If I go to the story folder, I see the photo I just dragged down in the background. I'll drag that up to content. I'm rushing through some of this because we cover this in another video. But what we're talking about here is how to edit this superstory. So when I open up this story folder, in News Director, you see that there is not a media neutral text. There's only one text, and it is embedded in a package called O1V, which for short we call the V1 package. It's always going to be at the top. I can drag my photo into that same package, and the photo too is now associated only with that package and is no longer media neutral. So I need to edit this as if it's going to be a standalone story for sure, but I also need to pull out the information that would make a good brief and put that at the top of the story. First, let me get rid of all this notes information. And so I'm going to want to copy and paste from this text to make my brief. So let's just say, for our purposes in this demo, I'm just going to copy and paste the first 3 graphs. So copy, come up to the beginning and paste it in. So this is essentially what I'm going to edit down to be my brief. And then the story itself starts after that. Now, I have to, of course, tell CCI that this is a brief and this is the full story, and I do that through tagging. So the first thing I want to point out is that you can put a tagline at the end of a brief. There are 2 tagline formats that are supported. One is tagline name and one is tagline credit. So let's give this a tagline credit. So once you've got the gist of your summary in place, you're just going to highlight it, including the tagline at the end, and you're going to apply a trim indicator tag. It's listed among the T's if you're in the all tags pane. And when you do so, you will get a blue box behind the brief. That makes it very clear, this is brief, this is story. For those papers that mount it as a brief, the story will be hidden. For those papers who mount it as a standalone story, the brief will be hidden. So that's all via the magic of the trim indicator tag. If I wanted a dateline, and I haven't even read this close enough to know whether this really deserves a Las Vegas dateline, but if I wanted a dateline, I can put it in the story itself, as I'm doing here. However, a dateline is not supported in the brief. If you put a dateline in the text of the brief, it will break the brief. So instead, just write the dateline into the start of the story, like that. All right, so datelines are okay for the story, but they're not okay for the brief. So we've done the tagging properly. What we haven't done is trim the brief down to the length that's required so that it will fit magically into all of our products. So in order to do that, we have to have some geometry to shoot for. So the way to do that is in the package that's already created, you'll see there's always an @ symbol at the top. That is where the attributes of the package are stashed. If you click on that @ symbol, you'll see them over here to the side. And near the bottom of that window, you will see a pop-up next to the words default shape. So if I click in that pop-up, I can choose super brief from among my choices and click save. And once I do that, there is now super brief geometry associated with this story. If I click on the preview here, I can see the headline and I can see the entire amount of space I have for a brief. So if I have more than that brief, more than will fit in that space already assigned to that blue box, then it will be overset as it is here. So I need to trim both the headline because it's got an overset, and I need to trim the other. Look, it fits. Okay. And here, if I go down to the end and click near the bottom, I can see the part that's not fitting in gray, so I know roughly how much I need to trim. I'm going to do a super careful trim, and it still doesn't fit. Now it fits. There's no more red triangle in the body. There's no more red triangle in the headline. The whole thing fits now. So that means any product that a designer drops this into a super brief shape, it's going to fit magically. Now you will also notice there's a little teeny tiny square photo at the bottom. You can totally ignore it. We don't run photos with super briefs. It is only there as a failsafe to keep a problem from happening with this photo. So you can ignore it. It will only show up for those papers that choose to run it as a standalone story. So once you've got it set up, you've got it trimmed to length, then you're ready to share it out to the to the products that can use it. And so you can go to your default packaging pane. And here, make sure you have the whole package selected, not just one element. And while the whole package is selected, you can choose which products you want to receive this text with checkboxes. You may have a long list like I do here because I chose common, so there's a lot to have to wade through, or you may have a shorter list if you chose one of these other subdesks when you initially set up the story folder. Regardless, it's easy to switch between them by just clicking this ... here. So even if you initially set up the story folder as common, if you now know you only want to send it to central papers, you can just click that ... go to ND central here, and you will see the subset that's just the central papers. You click apply. Magically, all of those packages are created based on the one we've already got. And you now successfully have set up a super brief. And just to close the loop, let me briefly show you what it's like for a designer. So this is the same story we just prepped. I'm going to open it on the page in Layout Champ. This, of course, is not something the wire editors are doing. But so a designer is looking at the page. If they were to drag that story you just created into an article that's waiting for a full story, then it's going to flow in. We have photo, we have the full length of the story, etc. The headline that we just edited. Instead, I undo and mount instead a super brief shape on the page and drag the story to the super brief shape. Then it fits perfectly. It is not too long. It's got the exact same headline. There's the text. Voila.